Kia ora, good evening. Welcome to one more session of Coding Night New Zealand. And tonight we have like a special guest, Simon Waight. Hello, how are you?
Hi, thanks Marcel for inviting me along this evening. I'm doing well, thanks a lot.
Yeah, Simon, the topic you're bringing like tonight is just like a really hot topic. If you could just give us some insights of what you're bringing to us.
Sure, absolutely. Look, I think probably the best thing to do is we'll get into the agenda slide to give you a bit of a feel for what I'm going to talk about this evening, and maybe then Marcel, you and I can have a bit of a chat about how hot this topic is. But it'd be really easy to just jump in and start doing code style demos at this point. I think a lot of people have probably already had a bit of a play with some of the tech generative AI. But I did want to talk about what is this idea of a 10x developer or a 10 times developer. Maybe you've heard about it. Maybe you've heard about it in a meme or a funny style of context. Talk about generative AI and how it fits into the AI ecosystem and how we got to the point that we are today. And it's been a bit of a journey. Talk about use cases for generative AI specifically for developers. Obviously, there's a lot of applications, broadly speaking, for Gen AI through other avenues, but today we're going to focus just on devs. Have a look at some of the risks in adopting the technology, and then of course there will actually be some demos to wrap things up. So, Marcel, that's what I've got in store for everyone this evening. Hopefully, that's interesting enough to keep people around. And thanks a lot, everyone, for giving up your Monday evening. Marcel, thanks a lot again for inviting me here. Seems like hopefully it should be a good sized crowd this evening.
Yeah, that's thanks for joining us and contributing like to the user group. Like the way like you disseminate like information, how you explain things thoroughly is just like great. Yeah, but thanks for that. So before Simon starts, I'm just going to introduce the user group. So if you are new to this session, right, or joining for the first time, I just would like to let you know that, well, we are Coding Night user group. We are a community group of developers, and we love coding. We follow like best practices on software development languages and technologies. In general, like we focus more on the Microsoft technologies because that's well, they're like we are developers working Microsoft technology, but we're open to any stack, to be honest. And the intention of the user group, as it's written there, like to enable developers with practical knowledge to excel and launch their careers. So, well, wherever you are, whenever you are like in your career, in as a junior developer to lead dev, you're always going to find like really good content just for you to learn or have like some awareness of the different topics we bring. I'd like to mention that we are part of azuretar.com. So we are a community of, um, I would say, developers and specialists that really love the cloud native space. And we talk about what the latest and greatest technologies coming on that. We're also sponsored by the .NET Foundation.org, which is an entity that looks after the different open source .NET projects, right? And with no further ado, Simon, yeah, I'd like just to give you the floor and bring like your slides to continue like the
Sure,
session,
thanks.
to start the session.
All right, thanks, Marcel. Look, it wouldn't be a presentation on generative AI if I didn't put my hand up and say I didn't design these slides. Pretty sure you can have a guess who or what designed these slides. In fact, I used the designer built into PowerPoint to help me design these slides. So hopefully they're good enough. I think it's a great use case for this sort of tech where maybe you're not a specialist, but you would like to add some pizzazz to what you're doing. So let's have a look at how we can add some pizzazz to our careers as developers by using generative AI. As I said, as I posed the question, can you become a 10x developer using generative AI? I'm going to just quickly hop over that, if I can get my clicker to work. I'll hop over the agenda because I kind of touched on that before. You've got an idea of where we're going this evening, so let's just dive straight in. The 10x developer, you may have heard it, as I said in my intro earlier. It's been popularized in the last few years through some online memes and postings made by various people, particularly on Twitter, or as we now call it, X, I guess, that kind of really dug into, I guess, playing on the idea that the 10x developer is, that person who is really super intelligent in the organization and understands everything from a tech perspective, but maybe is not always the best collaborative person to be around. And we'll take a look at what I mean by that in a moment. But it actually does have some foundation in some actual research that was done in the 1960s. This research, which was called the Individual Productivity Variation in Software Development, a really exciting name, I know, was completed in the 1960s. And what it did is it looked at, as the name suggests, the individual productivity of different developers. And what's interesting about the research is that it wasn't just looking at, say, people who are early career stage versus later in career stage, where experience may make a difference to how you tackle certain problems. But it was actually looking at people with an average of about 7 years experience in a particular space. And it used a synthetic set of criteria in the language environment to do the testing. So again, you weren't able to leverage potentially your expertise in a particular programming language or problem domain. You were faced with a synthetic example that you had to work your way through. And what they found is that the difference between the mythical 10x developer or the mythical best developer and the sort of the run-of-the-mill everyday developer varied quite substantially. So initial coding of a solution, best developers were 20 times better than the average developer. Debugging, 25 times better. Program sizes generally tended to be 5 times smaller. And the execution time was 10 times faster. So I guess that's where the idea of the 10x developer comes from. If you want to know more about this topic, there's actually a really good book from O'Reilly called Making Software, which dives in into a bit more detail into that research, which I think is still applicable today, particularly for those of you who might be running large software teams where you've got developers of varying degrees of capability helping you deliver your software. But let's talk about this 10x developer meme. So this is the kind of the thing that probably ignited the conversation in a lot of people's minds. This was kind of the start of the thread. If I click my button here, it should just quickly throw up a few of the others. Typical things: they hate meetings, they don't turn up often, they use a very plain background, they know every line of code, they're a full stack engineer. They convert thought to code. They rarely look at documentation and languages ahead of everyone else in the company. Blah blah blah. They really plays up on the, what I like to call, and excuse the language, the intelligent arsehole. So the person who maybe seems to know quite a lot, but isn't always the best person to be around. So people were kind of like really paid out on this particular individual on Twitter, and like, oh, come on, you can't really say that. And it's actually true. The 10x developer for me is not the person who is the most technically proficient, can deliver the best solution. It's actually the person who can collaborate and work the best and bring the other people around them on the journey with them, rather than being miles ahead of everyone else. So that's kind of the 10x developer concept. I thought it was worth talking about, just in case you thought I was going to say you can actually be the 10x developer using generative AI. Let's have a look at the generative AI side of that equation. So how did we get to where we are today? AI and ML has been probably top of mind for a lot of people for at least the last 5 years, probably for the last decade. A lot of that's been driven through the increasingly easy access that we have to large-scale compute and data storage, which are kind of two key components to being able to do machine learning and artificial intelligence at scale. But actually, the idea of artificial intelligence goes all the way back to the 1950s and to 1956 specifically. So there was work done in this field before then, but for a lot of people, the kind of the foundation of artificial intelligence came out of an activity that took place at Dartmouth College in the United States, which was called the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence, where a series of practitioners got together and talked about the idea of what is artificial intelligence and how do we measure it, and what sort of impact do we expect it to have. Now, there's a pretty big gap in my timeline there from the mid-1950s all the way through until sort of the late 1990s. Work did happen between those two dates, but this would be a very long slide and probably a very boring talk for many people if I did every station on the journey. But kind of the big breakthrough from a machine learning perspective came in the late 1990s with IBM and Deep Blue. So Deep Blue was the first AI-based system to beat one of the world's chess champions, so Garry Kasparov in this case, at chess, and not just through brute force. Clearly, that's a big part of large-scale computing systems, but through actually learning, the moves of the masters from previous generations and applying that to the structure of the game that they were faced when playing against Kasparov. We then sort of jump forward to 2011 and the idea of deep learning. So deep learning uses multiple processing layers to deliver outputs across large data sets. So traditional machine learning was maybe not doing as many passes over the data, but with deep learning, we suddenly have the ability to go much further into the data and generate further insights and capabilities in systems than we did previously to that. And then the next follow-on piece from that was this idea of transformers. And the reason why I talk about transformers is you can see in 2018, we have this idea of a generative pre-trained transformer, or GPT. So that's where the GPT and ChatGPT comes from. And it's a generic idea. It's not specific to OpenAI. And in fact, the transformers come out of deep learning. So they're a type of deep learning, and they were introduced by the team behind Google Brain, which you may have heard of previously. Transformers work well for natural language processing and computer vision. So, recognizing objects such as this magnifying glass on this slide here, or being able to look at text and extract meaning or summarization from that. So the difference with transformers with some of the systems that have come before them is that they process entire input streams at once rather than in chunks. And what they do is they use a special technique called, they have a special technique called an attention mechanism that provides context to them at any position that they are in the text input that they're being fed. And when we talk a little bit about, we'll look at Copilot later in the demo, I'll talk a little bit more about that. 2018, we kind of see the next iteration of transformers, and this is where we get into what we probably know more today as generative AI. And we have generative pre-trained transformers, and these are a type of large language model, but they don't require that the data that they're trained on is labeled. So traditionally with machine learning systems, when you build them and you train them, you can't just give them unstructured or unlabeled data as training inputs. You have to spend some time doing some form of data manipulation before you feed that into the system. With GPT systems, you don't need to do that. So you would have no doubt read or heard about how things like the Codex OpenAI model that sits behind Copilot was trained on open source data found on the internet, and the same for the ChatGPT model. Now, obviously, there are some challenges around some of that at the moment. You would have seen it in the press, people being not so happy that some of their outputs are being used to train these systems. But I think overall, working on the basis that things that are out of copyright or are published with a permissive license, most of the time, the vast majority of the data that goes into these systems is hopefully not impinging on anyone's rights to make a living from it, I would hope. And then the last thing I put on here is this idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And I guess this is the one, and I put, when are we going to see this? I don't know. There's been some papers published that suggested that OpenAI's ChatGPT was showing aspects of artificial general intelligence. That's the thing that's got most people concerned is once you have artificial general intelligence, at that point, you've really got an artificial intelligent entity that can solve any form of question that it's asked to solve. So at the moment, with things like Copilot and even ChatGPT to a certain extent, we have very constrained specific types of intelligence that solve certain types of scenarios. Once you reach AGI, you have a artificial intelligence that can be, capable of potentially exceeding an individual human's capabilities in any given field, not just one specific field. I think we're still a way off from that, and it's following, I guess, in the footsteps of traditional computing, where we started off with very specific systems, like the systems used to crack the Enigma code during the Second World War, where those computers were built specifically for that, all the way through to the modern desktops or the phones that we carry in our back pockets that are a general computer, where they run an operating system and then they can do any form of action that we require them on top of. And also quantum computing will start like that, most likely, where you have quantum computers that are good at doing things like complex chemical equations, potentially, hopefully, doing something like helping us with climate science. But then eventually we will have, in the longer term, general computers, and intelligent artificial intelligence will go that way as well. So AGI is the thing that people are concerned about in the future, but I think we're a little while away from that right now. All right, so that's kind of the general overview. Let's have a little bit of a look at what specifically we could use generative AI for as developers. And some of these will probably seem as obvious to you, but I think it's worth having a look through them anyway. So I've spent a large portion of my career adopting and working with other people's code bases, sometimes small, sometimes large. And absolutely one of the biggest challenges you face in those environments is to generate an understanding of the solution, of the code base, how it functions, what its purpose is, even maybe just a section of it where you potentially are adding new capabilities or fixing issues with it. Everyone would say, read the documentation. I don't know any developer that likes to write good documentation, or in fact, potentially even has the time to write the necessary documentation for their code bases. So being able to use generative AI, which is really good at summarization, to explain a legacy code base in an unfamiliar language potentially, is really going to boost our ability to be effective. We will take a look at that as part of our demo. Summarizing complex or broad changes submitted to software source control. So I cheated a bit here because this one's kind of already fairly close to being possible. You could actually write your own today if you wanted to, as a hook on something like GitHub, where you use an OpenAI model to actually parse the contents of a pull request as it comes into the system. GitHub is actually working on this as a feature for their service. It's currently in private preview with a wait list. I was hoping I had a repository with it enabled, but I was talking to Marcel about this just before we came on air. And for me, I think this is a really powerful multiplier for our capabilities as humans. It's not a replacement. Even if you write really good summaries in your pull request, which we all do, right? I'm kidding, who does that? You write what you think is necessary and then you move on to the next task. If you had a backup, a second person there who could then go through actually the whole set of changes that are in your change set as part of the PR and summarize them, that to actually allow the reviewer who will review that PR to be able to get a good overview of what's changed, not just the fact that you dealt with the bug or you added the feature, but that actually you modified these classes or this library, or you changed these interfaces, or you changed these return types. And then hopefully over time you could continue to tune that so that it's got some more understanding about your specific problem domain or your particular solution, so that the system gets really good at being able to tell you in human understandable format the changes that are happening as changes come into you through a pull request, for example. Converting implementations between different languages. So this might even be something as, I'm going to say simple, but it's not simple. Might be converting between different generations of the same language. So if you think about, Java, I know we're here for a Microsoft-based meetup. Even talking about .NET, if you think about .NET framework, if you're on 4, and you want to move to 6 or 8 when it comes out. Now, there's not a lot of difference in the syntax in those languages, but obviously some of the APIs have either been deprecated, retired, or changed, particularly in the case of .NET, where you went from .NET Framework to .NET Core, where the APIs got rewritten, and some of the APIs that were available in .NET Framework no longer exist in .NET Core. I'm sure as a developer in this space, you've probably been asked to make that shift. It seems easy enough to start off with, and in simple code bases it is, but in complex scenarios, it can be a challenge. Now, imagine if you had a tool that could help you make that transition without necessarily having to understand all the intricate details of the language. So I think that would be a good use case. Could be that you adopt source code from somewhere else through an acquisition, or you buy a third-party library. Maybe it's not in the language that you need it to be because you maybe don't work with Python or Ruby in your organization. So if you had a system that could convert that into the language that you do want to support, absolutely possible to do with a well-trained model. Generating documentation and unit tests, again, in addition to a human. We'll talk about some of the risks around at least the unit testing side of this a little bit later, but I find generating documentation is actually a really powerful boost, even in really simple scenarios where potentially you're writing C# and you want to have a summarization block on your method or your class, and you can use, say, a Copilot extension in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code to help generate that documentation block, and 99% of the time it'll give you exactly what you want. Yes, you could probably use a third-party plugin that already exists to do that, but if you've got a general tool that you can use in lots of other situations as well, I think that's a really positive outcome for you as a developer, and hopefully your business and team through minimizing a number of tools they need to use. And then identifying reuse patterns in existing code bases. So refactoring. Yeah, there are lots of tools out there today that do that really well. I think this again would be another use case where you maybe have a single tool that can do lots of different things for you, and you can maybe use this in place of a range of other tools that you might use to do that already today. So there are some risks. We've kind of talked about the benefits and the opportunities for improving our lives as developers, but there are absolutely some risks to go along with this. And you've probably seen a few of these in the press already. It's probably been a bit hard to miss in the last year. And I'll talk a little bit more about a couple of examples of this in a minute. But certainly data leakage is one of them. And I think data leakage is more applicable when you are using the wrong tool in the wrong context. I think part of the adoption of this in the enterprise, certainly from what I'm seeing, is ensuring that the right use of the right tool is taking place. And in fact, the Kickstarter for this presentation was a blog that I wrote back in March, where I talked about adoption of generative AI in your organization, because it's really easy to access the tools or turn them on and start using them. But you need to do it in a way that's going to tick a bunch of boxes, particularly if you're in a business where potentially you're in a regulated industry where you have to meet certain compliance criteria. And also if you've got IP, right? And if you're writing software, that's probably going to be considered IP by your employer. You don't really want to be giving away your IP by posting it or pasting it in the wrong place just to help improve, say, a single function call in your code base. I think the other risk is, generative AI is non-deterministic. So what do I mean by that is, you can ask it the same question 3 or 4 times, and it's not guaranteed that you'll get the same answer for each 3 or 4 of those occasions. It's also, even in the case of Copilot, which is trained as a model specifically for source code, is it doesn't always give you a good answer. It will give you an answer that looks like it's good, but it is just generating text. It doesn't always, or it doesn't understand the rules of the language that you're using or the framework that you're using. And often it will give you a response where it might have a function call to a function that doesn't actually exist. Logically, it should exist. The model thinks it should exist, but actually in the framework, it doesn't exist. Now, you can help correct that by telling the model that it got it wrong, and it will hopefully go, oh, I got it wrong. Okay, well, here's another way that you could do it. And the second time, it'll give you the right response. Incomplete response, so it doesn't actually give you the full answer. That might be because you've prompted it incorrectly, but that is a risk that you might hope that it's going to give you the full answer to the particular problem that you're facing, but it might only give you a part of the problem. Or insecure responses. So again, it's generating text. Most general generative AI models like ChatGPT, or the GPT-4 model that sits behind ChatGPT, they don't know anything about things like SQL injection. So if you ask, the model to generate you some PHP with a SQL call to a users table, it's not a guarantee that you'll get back a SQL call or a bit of code that doesn't include a SQL injection attack. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide, because there are ways to avoid that as a challenge. So here are a few examples. And the first one, it's an interesting one. It's actually, these folks were doing this as a kind of a promo for a webinar that they ran. So the Vulcan business is a security business, unsurprisingly. But I thought this was actually a really novel way to look at things. So when you talk about AI and you talk about hallucinations, it's just an error. It's just a nice fancy way to dress up the word error in this context. And really what it is it was that scenario I gave before where the model returns a response that includes a reference to something that doesn't actually exist in the language that you've asked it to generate it in. This particular webinar was about node solutions specifically. And what they were suggesting is that if you ask a generic model like ChatGPT to generate you a node solution, the node packages that you might pull into the solution to actually have it run will be referenced using import statements. Sometimes it'll generate non-existent package names. So it'll import something from some package name, and that package name won't exist. What these folks were suggesting is that over time, nefarious actors will actually go out and craft packages that they will publish to, say, NPM, that will have nefarious code in it, that when the model suggests a non-existent package name, it'll actually find an actual package name and import it, and you, as the developer, will be none the wiser. Now, obviously, supply chain security and security scanning can help remove a lot of the risk around that. But I did think it was a novel suggestion for a potentially new avenue for people to attack you as you build software in your organization. The next one about Samsung, this one was in the press, so it's a pretty good chance that you read about it. But the summary of that was a set of engineers in Samsung in Korea was looking for a way to improve some internal tooling that they have in their organization. I forget specifically what it was about. I think it was to do with their smartphones. And what they did is they actually took their proprietary code and they pasted it into the free version of ChatGPT. Now, what they probably failed to recognize was when you sign up to that free version of ChatGPT, it clearly says that they will keep whatever data you paste into ChatGPT in that context and use it as training data. So basically, you shouldn't put anything that's proprietary or personal or otherwise private into the public open source version of ChatGPT or the free version of ChatGPT. The OpenAI version of that that's hosted on Azure is slightly different. It doesn't behave like that, but certainly the free ChatGPT 3.5 version that you maybe have had a play with, it will do that. So, you can imagine what happened at Samsung as soon as they did that. It's like no more access to any of that, which has become, unfortunately, the default for a lot of organizations. This one on the bottom left here on Copilot. So this was actually a bit of research done around assessing the outputs from Copilot from its suggestions in relation to how secure they were. So this is going back to that idea on the previous slide about SQL injection. When they ran this research, which was a little while ago, they found that, because the system doesn't understand what is secure or insecure code in a particular scenario, it would periodically generate code that you wouldn't want to see in your code base. Now, in the meantime, GitHub has worked to filter out a lot of the responses that would be considered insecure. It's not a guarantee that it's going to capture all insecure code, but the obvious suggestions that are insecure are not being returned by Copilot anymore. And I think that's been that way since, I want to say, earlier this year, at least. And then this last one, I actually just picked this up this afternoon when I was just going through and reviewing the slides for today's session. And this was actually published in just in August. And it had a look at Stack Overflow, everyone's favorite Stack Overflow. So I've got a t-shirt on today for Stack Overflow, which you probably can't see, but it's got a display saying, hey, Stack Overflow, help me, you're my only hope. We've all used Stack Overflow. It's still a great resource, despite some people suggesting online that it was on a downward trend. I'm assuming that a lot of the data that's probably gone into the models that we're using has probably come off of something like Stack Overflow as well, where it's allowed. But what they had a look at was, for the same sort of question, do you get a better quality response or a more accurate response out of grokking something on Stack Overflow by doing a traditional search? Or do you get a better response out of asking the same question to ChatGPT, so specifically ChatGPT in this instance? What they found was that the ChatGPT answers were 52% inaccurate, and that 77% of them were overly verbose, so they didn't need to be as long as they were. But if you've played around with ChatGPT, you know that it can't really just say yes or no. It has to say yes and then give you a very long explanation as to why it's yes. And that's the case here. So I think this is probably a case of wrong tool for this scenario. I know a lot of people I've spoken to have talked about using ChatGPT specifically for helping them deliver solutions. It's not really designed purely for coding. It can do it, as can things like Bard from Google. But really, they're not designed as code-specific solutions. That's where Codex, which sits behind GitHub Copilot, has been tuned specifically for coding exercises. So you're better off using a very specifically trained model like Codex versus ChatGPT for these sorts of situations. So just following on, so that was kind of 4 high-level scenarios. I think these are probably more longer-term challenges that we've faced through adoption of this technology. But you can imagine if you come to rely on this friendly sidekick to help you solve those gnarly questions that you might have, or to quickly get an answer that might take you a minute to search online for, and you can get it in 30 seconds. Over time, you might lose a lot of organizational know-how. And what I mean by that is, the people who've solved those hard problems before maybe haven't had to solve those hard problems anymore because it was just a search away. Now, is that really a risk or not? I don't think so. You could have probably said that when the internet first became a thing. Oh my God, all of a sudden, all of that knowledge we had is going to disappear. It's all at our fingertips today. It's in our back pocket on a phone. I think we can all agree that we're probably in a much better place collectively as that. Yes, we do rely on an awful lot. Yes, it's not always accurate, but I think overall, we are better off with it. But I do think, if you come to rely on any technology too much, how much of your inbuilt team or organizational knowledge are you giving away as part of that because you don't remember how to do things anymore? Bloated code bases. You think about asking an AI model to generate you an API to retrieve all of the entities that are in a 30-table database that sits in your organization. It can absolutely do that. It will go away, or it could absolutely do that. It could go away and generate you, thousands of lines of code that will give you a nice, fresh API that will give you every single permutation that you want. My question to you is, do you really want that? I don't think so. It leads to a large amount of code in your code base that will probably never be utilized. That presents a risk both from a security standpoint, because if you're not using code, it doesn't mean somebody can't find it and use it for nefarious purposes. And it also means you've got a maintenance overhead, because you then have to wade your way through lots of code to actually find and fix bugs, because you just literally got more code to look at. I think that also leads onto that idea of unit testing. Do you really want 100% code coverage in your code bases? I'm sure there are people out there that go, yes, I do. My answer to you is probably you don't, because if you think about the amount of code you have and then the amount of tests you would need to generate to test every permutation through every path in your code, you probably would be 2 to 5 times the size of your code base for your unit code base. Now, imagine if you were running all of those unit tests in every single scenario that they had to be run in. Imagine how slow that would be for your teams to work through, and how much of a maintenance overhead that would be. Now, you could argue if you're generating the APIs using AI and you're generating the unit tests with AI, can't the AI just update the unit tests when the AI updates the API? Maybe. But I would argue you don't really want to have bloated code bases in any variety. So I think, use with caution would be my statement to that. Missing out on novel solutions. You know what these models are really good at? They're really good at giving you the answer to the problem that's already been solved, or giving you an answer to a problem that's maybe not been solved exactly, but it's close enough to the one you're trying to solve that it can give you an answer. What they're really terrible at is giving you novel solutions to novel scenarios. So if you're working in an unfamiliar code base to the model that you're using, maybe you're working with a brand new language that not many people are working with, you're probably going to struggle to get valuable output from the model. It's also not going to be really good at solving a solution in a way that maybe a human could, because sometimes we think outside the box and we don't follow the rules of logic. We think about trying things that make no sense logically, but then they turn out to work. The famous one for me here, John Carmack, who was one of the lead engineers, or the lead engineer at Oculus, was one of the founders at id Software. He generated, he came up with this idea of Carmack's constant. In the early days of 3D game engineering, he wrote the engine for Doom, for Quake, and this was in the days where we didn't have the compute technology we have today to do a lot of the fancy graphical work. He found a way through coming up with a constant value in his libraries that he used inside of his game engine to speed up the game engine. Now, I would posit the theory that an AI model at the moment would be unable to come up with something like that. And I think if you talk to Carmack, he would just say, I came up with it because of X, Y, and Z. And an AI model doesn't think like that, at least not with the generative AI models that we have at the moment. Next one is customizing your GPTs so they're trained on your code bases. I don't know about you, but I'm not always really happy with some of the code that I write. And I would argue that the vast majority of the code in the universe is probably not of the best quality. Do you really want to train a model on mediocre code? What's the result of that going to be? Probably going to be more mediocre code, probably not where you want to go. There is the idea that over time, as more code is generated by AI, and that is provided as training data to AI models, what's going to happen? Probably going to be a downward spiral of capability in the models because they're being fed on machine-generated data already. That's a very dark view of the world, but it is a reality. And that doesn't apply just to coding models. That also includes OpenAI's GPT models as well, and other models. The more you feed junk into them, the worse they get. And in fact, you probably have seen some of the stuff in the press about how people think that the GPT models have decreased in capability in the last few months. You can imagine the volume of training data they've seen, given how heavily they've been used. I don't know about you, I don't ever really ask it really difficult things, so it's probably not getting trained on really super intelligent stuff for the most part. And then the last one, and that's probably the top of mind for a lot of people, is job security. Every change in technology has an impact on somebody. That's the reality. The internet had an impact on some people. The cloud has had an impact on some people. The introduction of the desktop computer definitely had an impact on some people. My caution here is that I think AI as an augmentation, so not artificial intelligence, but augmentative intelligence, is going to be a booster. It's going to be an improver for people. You're going to be more productive being more productive hopefully means there's more space for doing the interesting stuff and maybe the need for more people to do more interesting stuff. So I think job security at the moment, absolutely, some people will be impacted by it. Some people have been impacted by it, not necessarily directly in our industry. But, you know, the reality is if you're on the train and you're paying attention and you're understanding the technology and the benefits, hopefully you're going to benefit from that directly and not have a negative outcome. This is kind of the summary for me. It's like, you know, with all of these risks, you need to just take a step back and go, just because you can do something actually doesn't mean that you should. You should actually sit down and assess the risk of doing certain activities, and not just from a technological standpoint, but also from a human standpoint as well. I think we owe it to our people and our businesses to make sure that we're taking a holistic approach to the adoption of this technology. And I think the people who do this appropriately will win out in the long term. All right, I promised a demo. I'm at 40 minutes. Let's see how I go with the demo. I don't see any questions coming in, so either I'm doing really well or people are just stunned and they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
All right, let me just see what I can do here. The slideshow, cool. So I was having a bit of a play. This is just in Visual Studio Code on my machine. I've got GitHub Copilot chat installed on this.
Simon, can you please just zoom in a little bit, please?
Absolutely, yeah. Let me just, well, before I do that, what I'm just going to do is, let me just see here. I'm just going to start these things up in the background, and I will zoom on these as well. So let's start that one. So I've just gone for a while, but let's zoom in on this. If I can get it to zoom in. Zoom.
Control plus always works.
Yeah. It's it wasn't working for me there.
All right.
Let's just open chat here. So I've got Copilot installed. It's running in the background. You need to have Copilot installed to use chat. I'm logged into my GitHub account. I'm lucky enough to be in the preview for this, and it's pretty cool. I just have a really simple create table statement here. So a bit of SQL. I write SQL so infrequently, it's not funny. Let's say somebody came to me and said, actually, what I want to do is I want to take data that's in a table that looks like this, and I only want to include, I want to create a new table, but I only want to create a new table where the comment was after the 1st of January 2023. So I can ask Copilot and say, you can be nice and polite with Copilot, but I don't think it's going to come after you if you're just kind of direct and ask it directly to do things for you. So let's be polite and say, so at that point, I could just go over here and just copy it in there. And so there's a really simple example. You know, my SQL is probably good enough that I could have done that. But you can imagine if you had a more complicated schema and you wanted to write a complicated query, this one's pretty easy to see that it's going to be no problem. Complicated queries, you might need someone who's a DBA to just QA it, make sure that it's good. I have used this to modify store procedures to try to create optional parameters on the store procedure, and the response I got from Copilot didn't actually work, but it did give me enough info that I could go off and finish the solution myself without having to go and search on the internet. But you can imagine if you're not writing a lot of SQL, this would be a good way to quickly get going, and I can see I didn't have to give it anything other than the, based on the one that was already open. Here's the date I want, and then it's also converted the date into the right format, right? So that's pretty awesome that it can do that for you. Like for me, that's a real boost to performance. So let's just open up this. I suspect this will probably want to be updated quickly. So let's just update the So Code Spaces is pretty cool because it's just Visual Studio Code in the browser. To be able to use Copilot Chat in this scenario, you need to be running the Insiders version of Code Spaces, but it's basically just Visual Studio in the browser. Hopefully this should run quickly. So all I've done is I've just needed to update the extensions that are installed just to get the latest bits. So once they reboot with the right extensions, I should be able to do this. The chat's probably going to come up pre-populated, so we'll just clear that because I've done this demo a few times before. So this is just a simple that I forked out of GitHub into my own repository, and then I've opened it in Code Spaces here. This has got COBOL in. I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I wrote COBOL. Most of you have probably never written COBOL, which is not a problem, because I did it at university and then I never wrote it again, which is probably not a bad thing. So once the chat extension loads, it's just taking a little while to pop up. Let's see if this other one's loaded yet. Okay, this one's opened. So this one is Jenkins pipeline. So Jenkins is a popular open source CI/CD solution. Oh, that went away. So let's see, it's a race between them. Which one's going to open first? There we are. This one opened first. So, oftentimes people like to move between different build systems. Maybe you're migrating from Jenkins to, say, Bitbucket pipelines. So let's go ahead and see. This is probably going to be, let's do a clear on that. That's just me doing Azure stuff with it.
Are you able to zoom in a little bit more, Simon?
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. Yep. So I'm going to convert the.
Better, yeah.
It's fine. I'll show the source in a minute. I'll zoom back out once it's done.
Oh, sure.
Its bit. It's taking its time this evening. It's usually a bit quicker than this. So you'll see that it's recognized that it's a Jenkins file. I haven't had to tell it that, other than I guess it's probably taken the context from the open Jenkins file, but it can still just say the open file. So it's gone across and done that. So let's just open into a new file. Can we open into a new file? Set to a new file. So we could say that is a Bitbucket pipeline. Now, it's a fairly basic Jenkins file. It's not doing a whole lot. In fact, you could argue that it's maybe not done the right thing there. Like, to me, that looks like it's missing a bunch of details. But at least I've started with the right construct here. So you can bully Copilot a bit. You could say that pipeline looks like it's missing some stuff. Let's see what it says. That's interesting. So maybe it was feeling a bit lazy, wanted to. So that seems a bit more detailed. It's still missing like the sending out the email and stuff like that. And this is really simple. It's just calling some shell scripts here, and then it's doing a Docker build using a shell script to do a Docker build, and then sending an email. In fact, no, it's not. What's it doing? It's SSHing somewhere to do a Docker run. So that's maybe not a good example. Let's just grab another example here. In fact, let's see if the other one is finished and open. Why is that not opening? It's interesting. Yeah. So my chat, wonder if it's because I'm not logged in. Should be logged in because I'm in a code space. Let's kill this off. Let's close that. Stop that. Okay, it doesn't know that's running. That's fine. What I'm just going to do is going to refresh this so it reloads. Well, at least it's a live demo, right? I can't claim that it's pre-canned because it's not behaving itself. Let's see how we go here.
Yeah.
So definitely have the extension installed.
We have like a question on the chat. I don't know if you want like just to come to that while things load. So on that one, right? So we have like here Vinicius Paiva. Hi, Vinicius. And he's saying like, hey, I work in a highly regulated sector where AI tools are off limits. Curious about practices in medium or larger enterprises. Are most holding off on AI until they're confident in its safety? What's your view on that, Simon?
So so regulated industry is an interesting one because there's obviously more than just your personal or your business IP at stake there. There's also regulatory and compliance aspects to the work that you do. So being able to do things like, prove, what's the word I'm looking for? Have, the ability to provide an audit trail for certain activities that, say, your software development teams are doing. All of a sudden, if you're using a black box AI system to generate some of the source code for you, things may not be in the best state to meet your auditability requirements. Trust me when I say there's lots of interest in this at an enterprise level and in a regulated industry level in Australia, at least. I can't talk so much about New Zealand, but I would imagine it would be the same because it's pretty much worldwide at the moment. What I think is happening is access to generic public services like ChatGPT, for the most part, are being forbidden under terms of employment or through responsible soft space. And I can only talk about the Microsoft space specifically. There's definitely interest in starting to consume services like the Azure OpenAI services, because they start to meet some of those higher level requirements around controlling where my data goes, making sure my data is held within Australia, so it meets sovereignty requirements, making sure that my data is not used for training purposes for a generic public model, because you don't want your business's IP to be used to train your competitors' services. So that's where I think, and part of the reason why Microsoft's gone so heavily into that space is because the demand is there for those restricted access services. There is also, there's this focus in the industry on moving away from large language models that require the use of sort of cloud level compute to run, to a smaller scale of model which can be run on the edge, even potentially in your own data center. So you might have a need for an air-gapped solution. So at the moment, with something like the OpenAI models, you can't do that. Certainly the traditional Azure Cognitive Services models that do some of the stuff that OpenAI's models do as well have had containerized versions for quite some time. So you can actually grab those containerized versions and run them in your own environments. There are some requirements around being able to phone home occasionally to validate approval to use, but apart from that, you can run them on the edge, and I know many customers do. So I don't think it's so much about safety. I think safety is not really the issue here. Like, I don't think you're going to suddenly start to see AI models flying aircraft. You know, I think we've all seen Tesla's self-driving car challenges, you know, some of which sadly have been, it seems, bad enough to have resulted in some deaths in some cases. So those sorts of problems, just the sheer volume of data that those models receive and the decisions they need to make off of that data makes it a much more difficult space than the one we're talking about tonight, which is, you know, generating software or suggestions off of the software. I'm just going to quickly talk about this. It doesn't look like it wants to play ball, but basically this demo, you can open the COBOL up. I'm just going to open a file just to see if it's actually going to light up once I do that. It doesn't want to for some reason. Now it's activating extensions. Let's see. Maybe I needed to open a file to force it to do something. Come on, you can do it. No. All right, that's fine. Maybe I've upset it. I was being too rude to it. That's fine. They'll go to sleep in the background. So yeah, look, it's a good question. You know, I did a talk with Damien Brady from GitHub, and that's a question that kind of came up. And you know, I think some of those challenges I talked about, you know, in the presentation. So when I was talking about where are we? There's a lot of probably the incorrect, incomplete, or insecure responses. I think if, as a business or as a team, today you don't use security scanning on your dependencies, or you don't have a proper lifecycle management solution for your code bases in place, you're already in a bad place, right? I don't think AI really changes a whole lot, because it's still just generating code. So that code needs to go through your pipeline before it gets anywhere near a production system. If your deployment process is the result of checking, compile, deploy, and that's it, then you're already in trouble. And AI doesn't really change anything on that. It probably increases the risk a little bit, but really, I think the story here is that the process you need is going to be that proper, you know, doing dependency checking, avoiding supply chain attacks, which are already a thing, AI or not, and then making sure that, you know, the people who are responsible for controlling what gets committed and delivered as part of your solution are, you know, across what's happening. So I think where the risk might come there is because suddenly you're generating volumes of code, because you have a tool that can potentially generate volumes of code for you. It might overwhelm people who are doing the checking, but I think that's maybe an opportunity to get more people involved in doing that exercise. Yeah, you could say you get AI to check it, but, you know, if the AI is generating it and the AI is approving it, at what point is there a human involved in making sure that this is, you know, this is up to scratch? And we are seeing, so for example, the European Union introduced legislation that requires explainability. And in AI model, when you use a black box AI model, explainability becomes really hard. How do you explain why the model did something? People who generate these models increasingly can't explain why a model did something. There's a theory, but there's not a hard explainability there. So that's where I think from a regulatory requirements perspective, we will go. And that's to try and safeguard, you know, over adoption of this sort of technology. But I think, you know, safety is probably is not a big one. I did this talk at an Australian federal government department. I'm not allowed to say who, because it's obviously a hot topic, you know, in government, and governments need to be seen to be having their finger on the pulse, but they also need to be seen to be cautious at the same time, because, you know, citizens might see this as maybe a potential risk for society. I think that's probably blowing it out of proportion. Unfortunately, the press loves to do that. And certainly when it's a thing that a lot of people don't understand, it's like the Terminator, the number of times we've seen the Terminator style thing show up on screen over the last few months. There are absolutely risks involved with it, but I don't think they're as bad as a lot of the press makes it out to be. So look, that was kind of it for this evening. I'll share the slides with Marcel afterwards, so you'll be able to grab these links later. But this is basically the top half of this is all the stuff I talked about. The first one is the blog that I wrote that kind of kicked off all of this. If you are interested in exploring, who's out there and is doing this, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. You could build your own if you really wanted to. I wouldn't advise it. You're going up against some of the world's biggest businesses if you do that, but it could be a good side project. But Amazon has their own Code Whisperer. I showed Copilot tonight. I think Copilot's probably the most advanced because they've been doing it for a couple of years. So they started adopting and building Copilot, I want to say in 2021, off the back of Codex. Codium, which is a smaller business doing this as well. They have a comparison. Take it with a grain of salt, because obviously the net result of the comparison is that you should probably use their product. But if you want to understand what some of the capabilities are of these different offerings, then that's worth having a look at. Google's an interesting one. If you'd have asked 5 years ago who would you consider the market leader in AI, and maybe some people still do, you would say Google. I think the generative AI burst in the last year has kind of caught Google a bit flat-footed. And I think some of that might be because they were so far advanced, so they obviously saw some of the challenges that were, over the horizon with some of this tech that we may be starting to see some cases of now. And they were a bit cautious about going too hard on it because, they don't want to be the bad guy who rolls something out that then has these negative consequences. But consequently, they're caught on the back foot with certainly Copilot and OpenAI and Microsoft's adoption of OpenAI through their suite of products. And it feels a bit like Google just kind of took a paint gun filled with ideas to do with generative AI and just kind of shot it at a like an ideation canvas or something. And then it was Google Cody, Google Bard, Google Palm 2, Google Duo AI or Duet AI, and a few other things. I found it really difficult to kind of get a definitive answer on, certainly when it comes to something like Copilot, what their go-to is. That might have changed in the last couple of months. It's been a little while since I wrote this, but at the time I asked somebody who I know at Google, I said, so what is it? Is it one of these things? So I know what Bard is. Bard is like, I guess, the Bing chat compete. But how does Palm 2 fit into that? How does Google Cody fit into that, and all the others? Replit Ghostwriter is pretty well known, and then Tab 9 as well. So they're kind of the ones to go and have a look at. The two papers from Arxiv are also worth going and having a read through. It's a really interesting open publishing platform. Always take some of the stuff you read there with a grain of salt because it's not peer reviewed, but definitely, in this space, there's been a lot of stuff written in the last little while by them. And that's pretty much it for this evening. Thanks a lot, everybody, for your time. Hopefully you found it an interesting exploration of the question, can you become a 10 times developer using generative AI? Hopefully the answer is that you can see some way to improve or, embellish your capabilities using this tech. And that's pretty much it. I can see no more questions, but I'm going to hang around. If you've got any questions, feel free to chuck them in the chat. Otherwise, you can get me on my blog, blog.siliconvalve.com, and all my social media links are on there. That's pretty much it, folks. Thanks a lot for your time this evening. I hope you found it interesting and worth your time. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Simon. Yeah, that was a insightful presentation. I think I like the context that you brought. It just provided us like awareness of like the different sort of applications, use cases, risks, considerations, right? And Yeah, I think like all of us as devs, I think that this topic in here, like in what you present, is just like, well, it's not only for us developers, right? I think the context that you brought up is just uh, vast. Like we could have like any other sort of uh, well profiles in here, not only devs, could be like even like business people like on this session. And yeah, I think like that one's a must see. And if you know like friends that were not available on this presentation, I invite just to share the link with others. That will be like really useful for them. I definitely agree with that. I'm going to be sharing with my team as well. So it's just like great resource for teams as well. Yeah.
Thanks.
And thanks
Thanks,
Simon
Martin.
for
Thank you.
being available for us, right? So I think that's great. Thank you.
Happy to come back. Maybe I can do a revision on this next year called "Can you become a 20 times developer using generative AI?"
Let's see, like where we're gonna be like on AI. Yeah. So
Yeah. Who
definitely,
knows?
definitely welcome. Yeah, to come back. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Look, it's an exciting time. I know it's maybe an unsure time for many people in the industry, but it feels a bit like the early days of internet adoption. There's going to be some, there'll be some, some slumps after this initial burst, but I think the tech is there. It's available for you to use. It's fairly accessible depending on which platform you want to work on. Definitely get your hands dirty with it and understand it, because I think it can be beneficial. If you want to talk more about it, you know where to find me. Happy to do this presentation if you've got a private audience you'd like that done to as well. But Marcel, thanks a lot for having me this evening. It's been great.
Cool. Thanks, Simon. And for the group, like we in general have like monthly meetings, depending like how things go. Sometimes we have like every 3 weeks or uh, 4 weeks sessions, but we always like focus on developers and content that you'll find like great and like very useful. And so with that, I just thank you for the presence, for the audience, and see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Cool. Cheers. Bye.